Welcome to the conclusion called Comparing Ideologies. So unlike the other chapters that we're looking at a specific political ideology, this one, as you can see, is designed to compare those different ideologies. So if you remember, your author mentioned that one of the main challenges with ideologies is actually comparing them. So the conclusion might be a little bit different than say other works where the comparison is much more clear. The methodology in doing so is much more straightforward. So where we looked at in chapter one that ideologies are very different, and there's no single way to look at each one exactly the same way as the other. So we'll begin here. So remember, if we had in another chapter where we looked at the issue of terrorism, for example. So remember, again, just as a good point of comparison, terrorism, for example, is not an ideology. As you can see here, it's instead a means or method of killing for a political end. So keeping that definition in mind, you can see that it's therefore used by many ideologies, right? So it could be nationalism or anarchism or fascism, whatever it is that is mentioned in this book. Anytime someone is going to the extreme of killing someone for some kind of political purpose, right? We see terrorism there. So again, continuing on, so adherents, people that would be in a specific terrorist group, they use those methods to attack their opponents and publicize their beliefs. So you can see that kind of dual purpose there, attacking opponents and publicizing beliefs, in a lot of the major terrorist groups of today and the past, right? Like the Irish Republican Army, Al Qaeda, Boko Haram. Remember we looked at as in an earlier chapter as a terrorist group currently operating in Nigeria. So Haram just means like sort of forbidden or sinful, and Boko means Western. So Boko Haram is a terrorist group designed or basically formed around the idea that Western education is sinful, or sort of Western ways, like say from Europe, United States, and so forth. So one of the most prominent Islamic terrorist groups in the world today, I'm sure you've heard of, is this group ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or President Obama and other officials here in the U.S. Often refer to them as ISIL, so Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. So the Levant area is kind of more or less the same region as Syria. They just don't want to improve put the name Syria in that group there. All right, so if you remember back from chapter one, we had sort of some different questions for comparison, and there was this sort of two-part way of looking at these questions. So one was sort of like, again, like in theory, like how should it operate? So the first part you can see here is how should society function? What are your values? What is the sort of ultimate goals? What would people really like to see happen in their society? And then the other part is more sort of the realistic thing. So how does society actually function? So again, value system and the social system in operation. Sometimes those might not necessarily go hand in hand. So society, or we might say a society should function a certain way, but then how it actually functions, might be a little bit different. So that's also part of what we're looking at with ideologies is, what's the sort of relationship between the value system and how it operates within the social system. So part of what the rest of this chapter will look at is all these different factors that help us sort of look at and compare ideologies. So for example, human nature. So that's a big part of all of these political ideologies. What is your sort of fundamental belief about human beings, how we behave, that sort of thing. Then other things, obviously. So law, equality, power. A lot of these, say for example, feminism, looking at power relationships, structural characteristics, and then say for example, the last chapter looking more say liberation theologies. Something like the relationship between religion and government. What are we looking at there? So part of what we'll see in the rest of the chapter here is that some ideologies might be more applicable to some of these different factors than others, or some ideology, again like feminism, might be more focused on equality and those type of things, freedom and liberty, as opposed to other ideologies. All right. So again, related to the social system, we have these sort of different aspects of society, all sort of working simultaneously. So one would be the value system. So again, we think about that more as sort of the hierarchy in society. So socialization is also an important part. So remember, socialization is just that lifelong process through which we gain or acquire political values. So, for example, children in the United States are socialized into our political system, mainly through family, school, church, community organizations, these type of things, right? Kind of learning what it means to be an American, that type of thing. Then we also look at social stratification, right? It basically means equality. How are people sort of divided in society? So this typically means more on an economic level. Say for example, if you look at a business, what are sort of the different levels there, going from the lowest paid employee all the way up to the highest, for example. And then we also look at, well, what about mobility within that social system? So, for example, unfortunately, this year it came out that sort of recognition that Charlotte did not want to receive, that there was a major publication that Charlotte, North Carolina, had one of the worst social mobility, or had worse social mobility than a lot of other cities in the country. So meaning that someone that really wanted to improve their station in life, improve their economic status, that it was more difficult to sort of rise, to kind of move up the sort of economic ladder in Charlotte than many other cities. So it's not a distinction that Charlotte was particularly proud of. So then we also looking at the economic system in general, related to that. So things about could be capitalism, communism, state-centered, a state-planned economy, that type of thing. What is a society using? What is its sort of values related to its economy? And then the last part you see I put here in bold, because again your book argues this is the most important, is the political system, or political systems, because these are binding decisions on the whole society. So again, if we think about the economic system, for example, the economic system we usually think of as operating within the political system. So, for example, just think about something simple like a dollar bill. That's an important part of our political system, but it's the United States government that is kind of issuing value to that dollar bill. Saying this is our currency. Again, the Federal Reserve setting interest rates, these type of things. So, although those are very connected, these political systems are binding decisions on the whole society. So again, that's important in the United States, Canada, South Africa, Australia, wherever we're looking at, again, their sort of political ideology, political system is going to be very important. All right, so let's get into some of those different factors here. So again, one of the, first and foremost would be human nature. So for example, if you look at American politics, a lot of, say, the philosophers that helped, shape some of the thinking going into the Declaration of Independence, those sort of issues, you can see some of the major differences as far as, what do people think about just the general characteristics of human beings? Are we sort of good at heart, or, working together, communal society, or are we, self-interested, evil at times, those type of things. So, whatever you believe about human nature is going to really affect the political system of a particular country. So, for example, democracy, which we would have here obviously in the United States, where we tend to think there's a high degree of community spirit, where it's not just about, ourselves, that we're kind of looking at what's best for society. So things like, everybody pays taxes that go to education, even people that don't have children, for example, because that's, seen as part of what you do for the community. We pay for roads even if you don't drive on them, these type of things. So democracy tends to recognize that humans are very complex, right? That especially say in large countries like the United States and elsewhere, when you have hundreds of millions of people, that obviously you're going to have enormous differences among the different people that live there. So switching again, thinking about some other ideologies, so feminism, liberation theology, for example, again they kind of look at the human beings as a little bit of a balance there. So simultaneously we have both a rational and an irrational side. So, again, trying to say, well, human beings might behave in a certain way, in some cases, and behave differently in others. So, we're not always totally rational, but we're not always totally irrational either. And then Islamic political ideology, for example, has a mixed view on some of these things, right? If you look at the importance of Sharia law, these type of things, maybe sometimes it can be a little bit more strict, thinking that human beings, need more sort of structure and order, that type of thing. But on the other hand, Islam is very sort of, conducive to community spirit, these type of things. All right. So again, maybe it just depends on your perspective as well. All right. So what about origins? Again, a large part, your author, I think, mentions that, this does not seem hugely important to most ideologies. Say, for example, people in our country today, it's interesting to look at some of these things, and I think it's worthwhile to do. But as far as, again, think about our country, Declaration of Independence back in 1776 was long before any of us were here. So he has this quote: "People everywhere find themselves in society and ruled by government. Therefore, the question of how this came about does not seem important." Although obviously it's important when we're looking at something like the Second Amendment, for example, about the right to bear arms, that sometimes people still use arguments that were made back in that time period and try to apply them to today. So sometimes those origins are important. Maybe the conditions at that time were far different than they would be today. So continuing on here, so what about obligations? We think about, if you remember social contract or social contract theory from American politics, we think about those sort of mutual obligations or reciprocal obligations between the citizens on one side and the government on the other. So, we look at things like, why do people even obey government? Or why should they? Why do we stop at red lights? Why should we even pay taxes? Those type of things. So in a democracy, say like the United States, Canada, and elsewhere, one of the reasons or one of the ways that obedience is sort of justified, we can think about in our society, is that, well, what are some of the things that are good there with that contract? Does it provide security, right? So we have sort of security both internally with police and other law enforcement, and also externally with the military, obviously. Certain benefits, we think about Social Security, just something simple like if you get lost in the middle of the woods, the government will come try to find you. These type of things. All right. Again, that could relate to security a little bit too. Again, also required by the community. This level of public shaming there. That someone that breaks the law is not just seen as breaking the law from the government, but also sort of, you can say, maybe letting down his or her fellow citizens. Say, for example, someone convicted of corruption or child abuse, that type of thing, that it's not just a government issue, that's also related to the society. So then last part here is the ability of citizens to use system to bring about change. So, part of what we think about in the United States democracy, for example, is that, the system is always able to change. That what might be utilized today in our democracy could very well change in the next 20 years, something like that. So, to switch gears a little bit here. So Islamism, on the other hand, has this idea that the citizen must obey the ruler. So if you, for example, you think about some of the things going on in the Middle East with certain groups wanting to set up a caliphate with the caliph as the leader, that would be sort of the idea that the citizen has to obey that caliph, right? Because he would be seen as the interpreter of God's will. So again, a little bit of a different case than a democracy there. All right, so continuing on. So what about law? So this is our, so think about, well, what is law designed to do in a certain society? One example could be, or definition could be, a means of instituting and maintaining social norms. What are you supposed to do? What are you not supposed to do? These type of things. So in democracy, again, thinking about social contract theory, law comes from the people. We set up our government and we decide what the laws should be. If we find laws unjust, or that we don't need those laws anymore, then obviously we can change them. And then, say for Islam, for example, there are different opinions, obviously related to Sharia. Some more modern Muslims say we could change it a little bit. More strict conservatives say, look more what it was like then. So we'll go ahead and stop here and switch over to the second video.